Chapter 17. Conspirators and Dissimulators. Political Cynicisms 4. Conviction as Disinhibition. A long quote from E.J. Gumbel, Verschwere, zur Geschichte und Soziologie der deutschen nationalistischen Geheimbunde, 1918 to 1924. New edition, Heidelberg, 1979, page 13. See also the new edition of 4 Jahre politischer Mord, 1922, 1980. In Germany after the war there was no revolution, but there was a counter-revolution. What is commonly designated as revolution is only the fact that on the 9th of November 1918 all the monarchs fled in fear of a revolution. When they assessed the real situation, it was too late to keep up the fiction that they were still monarchs. Into the vacuum that had thus arisen as the bearer of official force stepped the army, represented by the soldiers' councils. They delegated their power to the National Assembly, and thereby committed suicide. The monarchists, after 9th of November, played dead, so to speak, and claimed that they only wanted to intervene to establish calm and order. Therefore they supported the social democratic government in the struggle it wanted to have with the left. In this way, the politically anemic forces and the resolute opponents of the Republic again gained power. Immediately, the dictatorship of means revealed itself. The government of 1919 could not get rid of the spirits it had summoned. The armed forces removed the soldiers' councils. They removed the leader of the Republic, literally, by having him murdered. With a steady hand, Emil Julius Gumbel, a Privatdozent in statistics in Heidelberg, as well as pacifist, radical Democrat and documenter of the injustice current in his time, sketches the outlines of the German Revolution of 1918 to 19. Its course was dominated by the interplay of social democracy with the reactionaries, the anemics with the blood-stained forces. What crystallized as the new political order in Germany was a dubious interaction of official parliamentary forces with anti-democratic and secret organizations. In the latter gathered those who wanted to pursue a politics of refusal. The officials allowed themselves in all this to bite into the sour apple of the given facts. Capitulation, the Weimar National Assembly, extorted acceptance of the Treaty of Versailles. Social democracy had let itself be made a fool of by the political opponent, or had offered itself as fool and stopgap measure. It took over the opponent's political inheritance without having looked to see whether it was really dead. Whereas those who were responsible for the war and the defeat had settled outside the country, or had submerged in the blustering national opposition, the Social Democrats, with Friedrich Ebert and Gustav Noske at the helm, risked presenting themselves as the force of law and order in a situation of volatile, revolutionary, counter-revolutionary ambiguity. They allowed themselves to be used to perform the work of the reaction. An older social democratic conviction complex seemed to emerge here once again. As early as 1914, social democracy had proved that it was prepared to fall into the patriotic line when it was a matter of clearing the way for the war. Thus, in 1919, it wanted to prove how efficient it was at ruling when it was a matter of administering the catastrophes of the other side. Twice within 4 years it said yes, gritting its teeth, to things that were irresponsible. Both times it showed itself to be the party of tragic, illusory realism in Germany. In order to appear completely responsible and realistic, it accepted the responsibility for the mistakes and crimes of others, became a collaborator of Wilhelmianism, and then, after the war, the business partner of military, bourgeois, and populist reaction. In its behaviour, it carried to the point of absurdity the antithesis described by Max Weber between the ethics of conviction, the pure line, and the ethics of responsibility, the view of what is given. For it practiced a conviction of responsibility, a readiness to accept responsibility as a substitute for conviction, formal realism as a substitute for constructive, relevant action. It did not try to understand that even a simple real reform needs a revolutionary core, and thus, after 1918, it bloodily choked off the democratic forces in Germany that wanted change. It wanted reforms without real interventions, and thereby achieve the highest possible degree of conservation, indeed, restoration. In this, a basic feature of Weimar mentalities is reflected: illusory realism, false sobriety, self-deception under the facade of the grand overview, positive conviction about the innermost disorientation, nihilistic anti-nihilism, a reckless readiness to assume responsibility. The naive pretended to be respectable and without illusions. The vengeful, disappointed, played innocent. After the pause for reflection until May 1919, by which time the German experiments with council republics also had failed, the men of the reaction had set their sights more clearly on their goals. Down with the props of the republic. The heads of the national and military camps were dreaming, already quite some time before the first serious counter-revolutionary coup, the Kapp Putsch, March 1920, of a great blow. And here is a long quote from Gumbel, Verschwere, pages 28 to 30. From a memorandum for General von Lossow, it is divided into a pure military part and a civil, political, economic part. The aim of both parts is to prime the entire people for the blow, and to psychologically prepare them for the work, for the spirit required after the executed blow. 1. Military part, an improvement of the state of affairs that can only rely on weapons. The armed forces execute the first blow, clear the air, eliminate quickly and ruthlessly everything that through weakness and criminality suffocates the people. After the executed blow, the part of the people at arms builds the main force for the so-called civil and economic dictatorship. 3. Preparations. A. Mobilization of the armed forces and students. B. Mobilization of the citizenry. D. Compilation of black lists. Part 2, the civil part, the press. Certain signs and mute indications, often quite harmless hints as soon as they again and again race through the pages of the press, will, to a large extent, solve the task of the education of the people. Under the cover of secrecy, the military right finds its true language. The conspiracy suspends the compulsion to dissemble in its interior. Outwardly innocent, inwardly cynicism as the normal tone. On February 11th, 1920, a certain Lieutenant, Mayel, wrote from Würzburg to the commander of the Berthold Armoured Division, a volunteer corps, which around 1919-20 mulled over plans for a great blow. Quoting Gumbel Verschwere 23. It is to be hoped that the coming dictatorship will not forget to declare open season on the Jews. One night would suffice to exterminate these dogs. Here I have already started compiling a black list so that the right ones will be beaten to death, for many a non-Jew also deserves it. From the start, the German conspirators practice a game with masks. Only those who can look innocent will be in a position to let fly when the moment is ripe. The Philistine cynicism, as it is revealed in Lossow's memorandum, presupposes for its dictatorship of means a propaganda of pure conviction. The civil preparations for the blow are thus necessarily respectable and publicly idealistic, apparently innocent. Quote, Gumbel, page 30, "The work is carried on publicly under the sign of the Anti-Bolshevist League." The higher the public goals, the more secretive the cynical means. Just how strongly the ways of acting and thinking of the German right were imbued with military cynicism is revealed by documents of the most spectacular action on the populist idealists, the murder of the German Foreign Minister Walther Rathenau in Berlin on June 24th, 1922. Here quoting Gumbel Verschwere, page 48. Just as Rathenau wanted to drive from his villa in Grunwald to the Foreign Office, his car was overtaken by another car driven by a student, Ernst Werner Teschau, in which the former First Lieutenant, Erwin Kern, and Hermann Fischer also sat. Kern and Fischer fired a machine gun at Rathenau and threw a hand grenade at him. Rathenau was killed instantly. After the deed, Teschau reported, "It came off. Rathenau is dead. We did it to provoke the Reds to an attack. We were out of money." The felons were recruited from the former Erhardt Brigade, later known as Organisation C, as well as from other populist, conspiratorial and anti-republican associations. Fischer committed suicide. Kern, the principal culprit, died in a shootout as he was about to be arrested. Gunther, quote, who was the most likely to spill the beans, end quote, suffered an attempted assassination with arsenic-laced chocolates. Quoting Gumbel, Verschwörer, page 49, "The most interesting personality is Willy Gunther." The author notes that he had helped work out the plan. In the war, he distinguished himself as deserter and forger of documents, impersonated a Turkish lieutenant, was exposed, punished for desertion. He took part in the Kapp Putsch and gained through this contact with Colonel Bauer and Ludendorff. He was a member of the League of the Righteous, the German League, the German Officers' League, the League of Loyalty, the League of Protection and Defiance, and the German National Youth League. At a nest evening of the latter league, he let himself be celebrated as Rathenau's murderer. Letters from Helferich, Ludendorff, were found in his possession. One of 10 letters from Ludendorff began, "Dear Gunther," and ended familiarly, quote, "with cordial greetings," end quote. In his defence, Teschau, who was presented as a populist idealist, claimed that he had believed that the trip was only a test drive. With threats, Kern had, quote, persuaded him to become an accomplice, end quote. He had acted in a subjective situation of distress. The young Ernst van Salomon, who was implicated in the preparations for the murder, also swore that he had believed that the plan had to do with, quote, setting a prisoner loose, end quote. The tenor of the defence ran, "Admittedly, they had the noble convictions that would suffice for political murder, but in detail it wasn't intended that way." Teschau enjoyed strong public sympathies. At the Technical University in Berlin, a public collection was organised on his behalf. The art of political dissimulation saturated the ways of thinking of the right-wing conspirators, since they regarded themselves as having been duped. In other words, since they used the duping as the basic lie to justify their actions, they demanded for themselves the right to declare a secret war on reality. Because they wanted to save populist illusions, traditional privileges, and patriotic megalomaniac fantasies, they proclaimed cunning to be the true morality. With a crafty hyper-realism, they set about defending their illusions. This resulted in several remarkable strategic plans. Gumbel notes that Organisation C also surrounded itself with political fantasies of the following kind, quoting Gumbel, Verschwörer, pages 80 to 81. By the way, the entire system of political fantasies belongs to Organisation C. The best example is a book by the former Major Sulf, which appeared as early as 1920, entitled 1934 Germany's Resurrection. Colonel Bauer, for whose arrest a warrant has been issued, wrote the preface. Here, as a means for Germany's resurrection, everything is affirmed that the opponents of present-day Germany accuse it of as a proof of the will to wage war. For starters, there is a Club of the Innocent. It has contacts in the whole country, and its goal is a war of retribution against France. Its head has no name, but is called the General, just as in the National Association Ludendorff was called Dictator L, and Erhardt simply Consul. The club also has innocent members who, until the last minute, do not have a clue about what is going on, just as the organisation Esserich, or the People's Militia. Former officers' boys serve as contacts among the workers. For the officers, mobilisation lists are compiled. A famous physicist invents a new means of war, a kind of radiation that causes all ammunition within a certain radius to explode. Disguised as cinema projectors, the individual parts are manufactured in factories, just as now in Shibungen, weapons are declared to be machines. On the decisive day, the general holds a speech, quote, "We will rid ourselves of undesirable elements without many pangs of conscience," end quote. The storm breaks loose. The Reichstag, which is nationalist to the bones, receives the general. The Reich president abdicates. The general receives unconditional power, an enabling act, the state of emergency. the enemy troops of occupation are defeated everywhere. In 1921, 10,000 copies of this book were already sold." End quote. The fantasizers of 1920 will prove to be the realists of 1933. Major Solf's scenario contains the politics of murderous innocence in embryo. The deceitful, crafty, and upright partisans of the Club of the Innocent project the spirit of simulation also onto everything surrounding them, particularly the political opponent, even when it is already sitting in jail. From Niederschönenfeld, the notorious Bavarian fortress for political prisoners, Toller, Munsim, etc., it is reported, and here quoting Gumbel Verschwera, page 123, "The Bavarian parliamentarian Hagermeister suffered unspeakably. He suffered from a very weak heart. The prison doctor adjudged him to be a malingerer who wanted to be transferred to a hospital so as to be able to escape. In mid-January 1922, a high fever set in. The prison doctor said, 'Herr Hagermeister, you are so healthy that if you were my private patient, I would advise you to refrain from further treatment because I wanted to save you the cost.' The next day, Hagermeister was found dead in his cell." Excursus 3. The Reasonable Bloodhound, a Social Democratic Elegy. Quoting Gustav Noske, "Someone has to become a bloodhound. I do not shrink from the responsibility." Quoting Sebastian Haffner, Die Verratene Revolution, 1918 to 1919. Bern, Vienna, Munich, 1969, page 77. On November 9th, 1918, the head of government under Kaiser Wilhelm II, Prince Max of Baden, knew that the situation for the Hohenzollern was hopeless. Quote, "We can no longer beat down the revolution, but only suffocate it." End quote. Suffocate the revolution. That means grant it a fake victory. Let it occupy deserted, exposed positions in order to trap it in a position in reserve prepared for this purpose. Said concretely, the Kaiser had to abdicate. The half-social democratic government had to become completely social democratic, and the Chancellor had to be called Friedrich Ebert. It fell to Ebert then to send the apparently victorious revolution, startled and disconcerted at the ease of its own victory, home, and to recreate order. In the words of Prince Max, to do on a macro level what Noske had already done on a micro level in Kiel. Ebert was thoroughly willing to do this, and Prince Max knew it. General Gruner suspected it at least. All three men were, at the latest, since the morning of 9th of November, tugging on the same rope. End quote. The fateful days of the German Revolution lasted from January 9th to 12th, 1919. At Ebert's command, in these days and nights, the Berlin Revolution, which pointed the way for the development of Germany, was shot to pieces. After, quote, Ebert's bloody Christmas, end quote, there had already been heavy fighting on Christmas Eve 1918 between reactionary officers from the Reichswehr and revolutionary naval troops, which ended with the sailors' victory. It now came to the bloody decision: should the new order in Germany be created with the aid of forces that wanted something new, or should only a stalling order be created that amounted to a conservation of the old deplorable state of affairs? Ebert had decided to place the slogan "Law and Order" higher than the promising revolutionary reshaping of the German situation. Legend has it that the fighting on January 9th to 12th was a communist uprising. It has been recorded in history as the Spartacus uprising. However, neither the former nor the latter can be taken seriously. It was not the case that Ebert and Noske drew together the reactionary volunteer troops to fire on communists. It was not groups of ultra-left conspirators on whom these units of right-wingers had to fire in the name of the Social Democratic Chancellor. For the most part, it was the social democratic masses of workers for whom it seemed self-evident that after the bankruptcy of the feudal bourgeois Hohenzollern state, a new democratic social order that served the interests of the people should rise. They had not the slightest understanding for the semi-conservative tacking of the Ebert government. Ebert, Scheidemann, Noske, in the eyes of the masses, they were no longer genuine social democrats. For the Social Democrats, as far as the popular, and not the official basis was concerned, were for clear relations and for a revolutionary break with the old powers. On January 11th, the Merke Gendarme Volunteer Corps, quote, "at last, real soldiers again," end quote, marched in a demonstration through the suburbs of bourgeois western Berlin. At its fore, a lanky and bespectacled civilian, Gustav Noske, Social Democrat. This is how he understood what he called carrying responsibility. Putting himself at the head of irresponsible, emotionally explosive, reactionary troops incapable of thinking politically. A few days later, the Social Democratic protege killers of the Garde Cavalerie Schützen Division, the Guard Cavalry Rifle Division, murdered the best minds of the revolution, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. The name Noske from then on became the trademark of social democratic illusory realism. The Noske period is a phrase that recalls innumerable murders for the sake of law and order. It designates the bloody months from January to May 1919, in which in Germany a social democratic government suffocated a principally social democratic mass movement with a clear tendency towards reform, in the way in which Prince Max had predicted. Through this role, Noske qualifies himself as a cynic of the coarsest kind. His concept of responsibility had the tone of a cynical disinhibition that strengthens itself by confessing to its own, unfortunately necessary, brutality. Someone has to become a bloodhound. This tragic password of the social democratic counter-revolution already breathes a fascist spirit. The latter equates responsibility with willingness to make decisions, which in turn disinhibits those responsible in a brutal direction, and the brutality is reflected once more in itself by expressing not only that it is this way, but also that it wants and has to be this way. The cynical tone now calls the social democratic tune. After Noske had gathered troops together, that is, held an executive organ of large calibre in his hands that all too willingly let fly at the local revolutionary councils and committees, he began to triumph. Noske, on January the 21st, 1919, quoted after Hafner, Vereinten Revolution, page 170, "The government must gain authority for itself by shaping a factor of power. In the course of a week, a battalion of 22,000 men was created. The intercourse with the soldiers' councils therefore changed somewhat in tone. Before the soldiers' councils were the factor of power. We have now become this power factor." End quote. We, that is, the social democrats, the bloodless ones, allied with their own deadly enemies. They provide an opportunity for the bloodhounds to get used to murder and manslaughter within a legal framework. The negligence with which Ebert and Noske came to terms with the existence of the Corps of Volunteers is incredible. Of those, only 68 were officially recognised, which, according to estimates, comprised almost 500,000 men. The minds of the commanders of the voluntary corps were thoroughly haunted by political fantasies, quote-unquote political fantasies, quoting Gumbel, of the type cited earlier. One of them, a Captain Gengler, noted in his diary on the same January 21st, 1919, quoted after Hafner, Vereinten Revolution, page 172. "The day will come when I will settle accounts with this government and tear the mask off the entire wretched, pitiful pack." End quote. Here, a pre-fascist speaks as enlightener who wants to unmask the Social Democrats, whom he recognises as dissemblers. Even the populists saw through Ebert's Philistine pseudo-realism that, as a simultaneously restricted and disinhibited conviction of responsibility, wanted to, quote-unquote, save Germany in its hour of need. Ebert's complex about dignitaries misled him to believe that reason could only be something that lies between the extremes. He did not comprehend that there can only be a midpoint between right and left, where the left principle had unfolded enough in order to be able to be balanced out. Ebert already had a middle course as preventive measure. Thus it happens that, lacking the left wing, the midpoint between the forces always comes to lie pretty much to the right. Thus it can occur that what is reasonable in a cynically bright hour will have occasion to confess to being a bloodhound. That is the tragic knot in German history of this century. With its false reasonableness, social democracy destroyed and hindered what was about to take place in Germany in those months, the Social Democratic Revolution.